I understand it's raining outside, so we're trying to give everyone a little extra time to get in to the auditorium. My name is Earl Lewis, and I am the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan, where I'm also a professor of history in Afro-American and African studies. And I am the president emeritus of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in New York City. Welcome. Welcome to the discussion of Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity and the American Promise. Out of Many Faiths is part of a larger initiative and book series called Our Compelling Interest. This initiative, which I co-lead with Nancy Cantor, the Chancellor of Rutgers University, Newark, seeks to document the many ways diversity aids in securing the prosperity of a vibrant democracy. From its outset, we wanted some of the book best scholars in the world and researchers to probe diversity beyond the numbers. Demographers assert that the United States will have a non-white majority by mid-century. Some have even gone so far as to say that the numbers will do the work for us. The numbers will take care of things. Nancy and I, along with our external advisory board, aren't so convinced. We believe in intentional actions. Thus, we launched a multi-year effort to really begin to probe what we mean by diversity and to bring to the general reading public a volume or two per year that aims to really summarize the best research on a particular aspect of the diversity issue. The first volume in the series, which bore the name Our Compelling Interest, was really designed to set the stage. It emphasized the need to define, to leverage, and to value diversity in all of its forms for the common good. Volume 2, the diversity bonus, conceded that diversity may not matter in every setting or every circumstance, but where complex problems are being considered, diverse partners and participants are key. In numerous settings, we discover that the more diverse the team, the better the outcome, hence the diversity bonus. Today, we get to explore the intersections between religion and diversity, religion and pluralism. I want to thank my colleagues in the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan for their hard work in making this event possible, especially Doreen Tenahara. And I want to acknowledge the gracious and able assistance of our dear partners, Princeton University Press and Chicago's very own Interfaith Youth Corps. Without them, this event would not have been possible. Thank you. Finally, I acknowledge the financial support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which continues to support an initiative launched during my time as president. And now, today's program. We'll begin with a little introductory video that hopefully will help contextualize today's conversation. Thank you. Our Compelling Interest is both a book series and a broader initiative to really examine diversity and its attributes and actually explain why addressing diversity helps to ensure a more prosperous America.
Our Compelling Interest book series really tackles a fundamental question facing American society today. Are we going to take the diversity, the enormous diversity on many dimensions of our peoples as an asset, as an opportunity? Or are we going to be threatened by it?
There are forces of prejudice and forces of exclusion throughout our history around race, around ethnicity, around gender, including around religion. I think what makes religion distinct is that the set of formal founders of the United States, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, their articulation of religious diversity is really inspiring. They set the North Star, and over the course of American history, different generations of Americans have kind of worked up to achieve that ideal that our founders set. What we have the opportunity to do here in the United States is build on an inspiring tradition of interfaith cooperation. And actually, really important things happen when people from different religious traditions, including no religion at all, atheists and agnostics and seekers, when all of us partner together, that's when we have the opportunity to achieve what we at Interfaith Youth Corps call pluralism, which is respect for different identities, relationships between different communities, and a positive contribution and commitment to the common good.
But one of the things that Eboo puts on the table is the notion that perhaps we can build this nuanced national narrative. The commentators in this volume take that question on. Is it too optimistic to imagine that we can? It's a little hard these days with so much divisiveness to think about it optimistically. But if we don't try, we will never get there.
In the 1940s and 50s, one way of assimilating, particularly coming out of World War II, more Americans was also to reclaim a more singular religious identity. We call it Judeo-Christian, and it was a way to think, okay, while we have a lot of differences, we're one nation. And we're now on a path where we have to expand and say, America is not just one thing. It's never been just one thing. It's actually made up of the intertwining of the fabrics of many different traditions, including many different religious expressions.
Islam in America has existed at least since the first slave ships came. And so we should see ourselves as part of American history from the beginning, as contributors from the beginning. And we now have the chance to contribute to America in a particularly special way, which is at a time that American prejudice is focusing on Muslims, we have a chance to expand the American narrative. I love the idea of not thinking of America as a melting pot, but as a potluck, which is to say this giant table that invites the distinctive contributions of various communities, not just so that it has one more chair for us, but so that it is large enough, capacious enough to welcome the contributions of all of those communities who will come after us.
The variety of experiences will excite the mind, stimulate the brain, encourage interfaith and dialogue, and maybe enhance our knowledge base and improve the ways in which we think about one another.
There is a public good or a benefit of having people not check their identity at the door, but rather bring their identity to the table with other people's identities.
We believe the whole question of diversity is important as we anticipate the America of the next 20, 30, 40 years.
I, for one, think that video deserves a round of applause. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Al Young. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Social Solutions and Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of Sociology, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And it's my great pleasure to share a bit with you about the objectives and intentions of the newly constituted Center for Social Solutions. So much of contemporary society focuses on the identification of the so-called right problems in our society. And in doing so, we often turn to disciplinary approaches in the academy, whether it be political science, sociology, history, or psychology. Otherwise, we turn to cluster approaches that bring together social scientists, perhaps those in the humanities or the arts, or a collection of engineers. Our center aspires to build from those kind of approaches and indeed extend beyond them, to invite audiences across the academy and outside of the academy to tackle some of the core questions and issues that affect our lives today. Indeed, aside from the book series, Our Compelling Interest, the project of the center is to tackle 3 critical issues in the next half-decade and provide some capacity for advanced growth and development in tackling these issues. The first has to do with the politics of water. It is clear in our society that we have mastered the craft of distributing resources or materials at faster speeds and with greater efficiency. The one resource we haven't is water. And hence the center aspires to convene conversations with scholars and other parties about how we might transfer water from areas and communities that are rich with that resource to those that experience drought, and what kinds of challenges and obstacles as well as unforeseen possibilities might remain for us in that project. The second concerns the experience of slavery in America. We are on the verge of the 400th anniversary of the arrival of people of African descent into colonial Virginia. And as we know, their arrival triggered the introduction of a system of chattel slavery, a system that defined nearly all aspects of life for more than 2 centuries. We intend to, in focusing on the 400th anniversary of this development, provide an opportunity for scholars and educators, as well as digital technicians, to create a portal and other mechanisms that link all of the authoritative and validated databases and digital projects on slavery for easy use and broad access across our country. We intend to create new pairings of museums, public sites, theaters, media, civil organizations, and colleges and universities to coordinate the presentation and programming on and about slavery for several years. Our third project on artificial intelligence, human labor, and the dignity of work is built out of the recognition that the arrival of artificial intelligence, or what has been called the fourth industrial revolution, has created worry about the loss of human jobs and what that will spawn. Some of the questions we will explore include, will we be able to produce enough new opportunities for the marginally educated? Will education produce an even higher premium in the near term that will force a rethinking of the old divide between education and training? We generally will tackle the question of what can be done, if anything, to address the plight of displaced workers as technology replaces many current positions in the workforce. That's the work that we will do in the center, above and beyond the kind of work that has brought you here today. This series, Our Compelling Interest, is the center of today's program, which will include a presentation by Dr. Robert Jones and an engaging panel discussion moderated by Dr. Nancy Cable and featuring John Anazu, Eboo Patel, and Laurie Patton, followed by a question and answer session to close the event. About 30 minutes into the panel discussion, we will be collecting the question cards that you were issued upon checking in for today's event. I ask that you kindly pass the cards away from the center to the aisles, where staff will be collecting them. And once the program concludes, we invite you to join us at a reception in the historic Chicago Stock Exchange room. Now for a word about our presenter. Robert P. Jones is the founding CEO of Public Religion Research Institute and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He is the author of The End of White Christian America, 2 other books, and numerous peer-reviewed book chapters and articles. Dr. Jones writes a column for The Atlantic Online on politics and culture, and is frequently featured in many national media outlets, such as CSN, MSNBC, The New York Times, NPR, The Washington Post, and many others. Dr. Jones serves as the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Religion and Politics section of the American Academy of Religion, and is a past member of the editorial boards for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and Politics and Religion, a journal of the American Political Science Association. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, a master's in divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a bachelor's degree in computer science and mathematics from Mississippi College. Without further ado, Dr. Jones.
Well, thank you for coming on a rainy afternoon here at the Art Institute. I'm very happy to be here before you. You heard Earl Lewis begin his remarks today by saying we're going to get beyond the numbers. We are indeed going to get beyond the numbers, but first, we're going to do some numbers. That's my job here, is to give you some numbers here. And we're also going to start with another theme. You heard in the video, Eboo mentioned a potluck dinner, a kind of dinner metaphor, and we're going to kind of come back to that. But I wanted to start with just this image here, and I'm going to move fairly quickly through some numbers that do tell the story of America's increasingly diverse religious and demographic landscape. But first, this photo here is one kind of image of a dinner, right? And it is a dinner that I think many Americans for a long time have had, of a kind of normative vision of America, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant vision of America. That's been the kind of dominant cultural footprint, both demographically speaking and in terms of cultural and political power in the U.S. And we're going to come back to that in a minute, but just kind of, this image, I think, is one that is rapidly changing as one that could plausibly represent even a demographic majority in the country. So let's just kind of start with where are we? The main really story here is increasing diversity and the decline of white Christian denominational and church groups in the country. That's been the basic story the last few decades in the country. So where are we today? We are a very diverse religious landscape. Don't worry too much about all these groups up here. I'm going to point to some patterns. And in fact, I'm going to move quickly enough that you want to think about this presentation, I think, as a little bit of an impressionist painting, right? I'm going to give you some broad brushstrokes and kind of pay attention to the patterns less than individual findings here. But the main thing here is to see this, all the blue hues here represent varieties of white Christian groups. You can see it's less than half. Right? That's a fairly new thing in the country, that we are less than half white and Christian of various kinds. The green slices here are non-white Christian groups. The purple hues here are religiously affiliated Americans who are not Christian. And then this big orange thing is also a fairly new thing in the American religious landscape. That is religiously unaffiliated Americans. So when you ask them, what is your religion? They say they are either atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. That number of nearly a quarter of Americans today claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. Just to give you a sense of how quickly this has changed, I'm going to go back not that far, just 2004, just to give you the one slice here of a percentage of Americans who identify as white and Christian in the country. If we go back just to the beginning of Barack Obama's presidency, 2008, the country was 54% white and Christian. By the time we had our last presidential election, that number had dropped to 43, and over the last 2 years, it's dropped down to 41. It's dropping about 1.3 percentage points a year over the last decade and a half or so. So that's a fairly quick decline in demographic terms that the country is really changing. And so just during President Obama's tenure, we go from being, descriptively speaking, a nation that is a majority white Christian to one that has no one group claiming the demographic majority in the country. That's a big sea change in the country. One other way of looking at this is if you look at generational strata. So if you want to think into the future, just look at what younger people look like versus older people. This first bar here are the percentage of each generational group that identify as white and Christian. So you can think about this as a kind of archaeological dig down through demographic strata here. So the seniors at the bottom, age 65 and older, Americans under the age of 30 at the top. But this is a dramatic difference. It's also linear. You could take a ruler and draw a straight line down through these stair steps, right, in terms of the generational divide, and see the generational change that's out in front of us. Nearly 2/3 of seniors identifying white and Christian, less than a quarter of Americans under the age of 30. And when I put up the other major religious groups here, non-white Christian groups in purple are other religions, and then that big orange block of religiously unaffiliated Americans, you can see virtually every other group is getting bigger the younger you go, with the exception of white Christians, which is shrinking the bigger or the younger you get. Now, this is also not just happening among young people or in big cities or on the coast. So this is a snapshot. Again, I'm not going to go back that far, just 10 years. 2017, the darker blues in this picture by state are higher concentrations of white Christians in each state, right? So around the Great Lakes and up around Appalachia, as you see this kind of U-shaped space here that's dark blue. Now I'm going to fade in 2016, 2017 data and watch the dark blue shift. right? So again, it's not just happening. We're going to kind of go back. So there's 2007. This is 2016, 2017 combined. In most states, this number is dropping 15 to 20 percentage points over this decade. So it's a big set of changes. And again, in most of these states, we're getting more religious diversity and more non-religious Americans as the number of white Christian groups drop. So take a look at what this looks like in terms of our relationships here. And the one on the left is a very interesting question. We basically ask individuals, do you follow the teaching and practices of more than one religion? Well, 16% of Americans say yes, that they themselves follow the practices and teaching of more than one religion. And about a quarter of Americans are married across religious lines. That is, their spouse's religious background is different from theirs. So that's 1 in 4. That's a fairly high number of Americans here. So that's just in terms of relationships and self-identity. The other thing you can see here is if you look at those Americans who are not intermarried over time, this is people who are married and the year in which they were married, you can see that it's dropped about 20 percentage points between 1960 and 2014, the number of people who are marrying within their same religious group. And you can see the number of people who are in mixed marriages of various kinds increasing over the same period of time. So we're getting some mixing. However, we can also see that when we look inside of religious groups, there is still a high degree of insularities. In other words, Protestants tend to be close friends with Protestants. Catholics still tend to be close friends with Catholics. Those of non-Christian religions still tend to be closer friends with non-Christian religious groups. The unaffiliated actually are some of the most diverse here. I'm just going to put up all the bars. But basically what you're looking at here is under Protestants, nearly 7 in 10, when we ask them about their closest friends, we ask them to name up to 5 people with whom they've had important conversations in the last 12 months. So not just people you know, but people who are like really in your inner circle that you confide in. 7 in 10 tell us that those people are indeed Protestants who are Protestant. Among Catholics, about 7 in 10 tell us their closest friends are Catholic. Those are non-Christian religions. They're much smaller, but even there, about half say that their closest friends are still within a non-Christian religious group, and the unaffiliated, about 44%, saying their closest friends are also religiously unaffiliated. So there's still some work to do in terms of kind of reaching across some of these divides. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with a couple of questions about what people think about these demographic changes, right? So it's clear that it's happening. It looks clear that it's not reversible. The question is, what do people make of it? I'm guessing you have some hypotheses here about what people make of it. And it turns out that the country is fairly split on a really basic question, and that is, the way the country is changing a good thing or a bad thing? So we have 2 ways that we've assessed this question. One is one that looks backwards. We ask people, do you think the country has changed for the better or mostly changed for the worse since the 1950s? Kind of using that mark, kind of the height of a kind of waspy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant demographic and cultural power. So it turns out the country as a whole evenly divided on this question, whether we've changed for the better or changed for the worse. And you'll see these groups on the left here that I have up first. These are the groups saying things have changed for the better. Democrats as a whole, religiously unaffiliated, Latino Catholics, African Americans, younger Americans, Latinos. And here are the groups who think things have changed for the worse. And you can see out here, those are majority whites overall, seniors, white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, white non-college Republicans, and no group thinks it changes for the worse. Then actually my people, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, white evangelical Protestants, 74% say things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. So it turns out if we ask a forward-looking question, we get a really similar pattern. The amplitude's a little bit different, but we get a very similar pattern here. So this question, we just said, look, the U.S. Census projections show that by 2043, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and other mixed and racial groups will be a majority of the population. Do you think this impact will be mostly positive or mostly negative for the country? And on this question, actually, Americans are more optimistic looking forward. Nearly 2/3 say this will be a mostly positive effect. Very similar groups over here on the left, but there are still a number of groups who are less optimistic about this. And 2 groups that are about half or more, Republicans overall, and again, white evangelical Protestants who tell surveyors, no, this will actually be a negative thing for the country. So I think one of the real challenges we have before us is that we are facing a very rapid set of religious and demographic changes, the likes of which, in fact, we have not seen before. And one real difference here is that whereas in the past, white, particularly Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were a dominant enough group that it was a sense of, yeah, you can pull up a chair, but it's our table, right? And I think the real difference now is that the country has changed enough where there's no one really owning the table anymore. And the real question is, can we pivot, right, so that everyone can pull up a seat at a very similar table? This last image here looks similar to the one you saw in the video. This is in fact a still from a Coca-Cola commercial, 2012, called It's Beautiful, where they ran America the Beautiful around this montage of different kinds of Americans. What's notable again, when it ran during the Super Bowl in 2012, and it actually caused quite a bit of backlash, right? There were people who say, no, that's not what America looks like. So I think I'm gonna kind of just tee it up there. I think that's one of the key questions, right, is who are we, right? Who are we? What do we look like? What does the country look like? And does this portend something good or something fearful? And should we be anxious about that going forward? And it is my pleasure also, while I'm here, to make an introduction to our moderator, Nancy Cable. Nancy Cable is the chancellor at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. She previously served as the president of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. She's a nationally recognized leader in higher education, educational access, finance and affordability, and liberal arts curricula. She served as a faculty member and dean at Denison University from 1977 to 1986, Guilford College from 1986 to 1991, and vice president and dean of admission and financial aid at Davidson College from 1991 to 2005, leading a college-wide effort to advance selectivity, diversity, financial capacity, and strategic planning. Dr. Cable later served in several leadership roles at the University of Virginia, and following 3 years of service as Bates College's vice president, she was elected to serve as interim president. She's written articles on higher education governance, access and quality and selective college admission, and assisted in the writing and research for an amicus brief from a small group of liberal arts colleges for the Supreme Court's Grutter case on preferential admission for underrepresented populations at highly selective colleges. Please welcome Dr. Nancy Cable.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for giving of your time and energy today for this important topic. And to Dr. Earl Lewis and Dr. Al Young, there you are, and also to Dr. Nancy Cantor, thank you for being thought leaders in a way that our society and our world today needs so desperately. We appreciate your leadership in this way and that of the University of Michigan. Thank you. It's my pleasure to moderate a conversation about the new text by Eboo Patel and his fellow writers called Out of Many Faiths. I want to introduce our panel for you today and ask them to come forward after I've introduced them. First is Dr. John Inazu. He is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis, where he is also executive director of the Carver Project. He teaches criminal law, religion and law, and various First Amendment courses. He writes and speaks frequently to general audiences on topics of pluralism, assembly, free speech, religious freedom, and other issues. Dr. Inazu is the author of Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly and Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. Would you join us, Dr. Inazu? Joining us next is Dr. Laurie Patton. Dr. Patton is the 17th president of Middlebury College and the first woman to lead the institution in its 218-year history. Dr. Patton is a leading authority on South Asian history and culture and the author and editor of 11 books in this field. She has also translated the ancient Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, for Penguin Classic Series and is the author of 3 books of poetry. The most recent, entitled House Crossing, was published in May 2018. Dr. Patton began her academic and scholarly career at Bard College, where she was an assistant professor of Asian religions. Dr. Patton then served on the faculty and administration of Emory University as the Durden Professor of Religion, and then following that, Duke University's Dean of Arts and Sciences until 2015. Dr. Patton has also served as president of the American Society for the Study of Religion and is currently the president of the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Patton was elected to be a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018 as a leader in 2 fields, religion philosophy and also education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Patton. And finally, Eboo Patel. Eboo is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, a nonprofit organization right here in Great Chicago that promotes interfaith leadership on college campuses and throughout thought leaders and higher education across this U.S. In addition to Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity and the American Promise, he is the author of Interfaith Leadership, a primer, published just last spring, Sacred Faith, The History of an American Muslim, The Struggle for the Soul of a Generation. He was named by U.S. News and World Report as one of America's best leaders. Dr. Patel served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council and holds a doctorate in Sociology of Religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. Eboo Patel, will you join us? Thank you. Well, I have the wonderful privilege of asking a few questions along the way while you're thinking of your own and passing those question cards to the aisles so that our staff members can collect them from you. And we'll get to quite a few of those, I hope. But I need to begin with a softball question to get us started. You have before you 3 of the finest leaders in this nation, I would say globally as well, who are thinking very hard about the issues of our demographic pluralism. It is here, it is with us, it is increasing. They are writing, thinking, and producing tremendous good thought leadership for all of us. So my first question is to remind all of us that this is a marathon and not a sprint. We're going to be at this for quite some time if we care about our democracy and we care about the stability and the vitality of our union here in the United States. So given that it's a marathon and not a sprint, what motivates each of you to keep working on this?
Well, that's a great question. I think the people, the reality of people and friends across difference. And Laurie, in your essay, you talked about just the beauty of sharing a meal together and how important that is. And in real life, away from Twitter and away from the national news cycles, I know real people who are committed to civic friendship and caring for neighbor and people of faith and no faith, and those people motivate me in the day-to-day until I check my social media sources.
That's great. Thank you for that question. That usually is the ending question, so it's great that you've got the beginning question. So I think part of, I didn't mention this in the piece that appears in the book, but much of the work on what I call pragmatic pluralism, this idea of elevating the fact that different religions need each other, that need is essential. It's not just celebrating difference, it's not just overcoming difference, it's not tolerating difference, but actually needing difference to survive. That comes from my students. So I have, as a president of an elite college, I have a very hypocritical commitment to there should be at least one place in my life every year where education is free and where I educate people for free. Because if I were in a utopian world, I would want all education to be free. And so I started to teach a class when I taught at Bard, and then a free class in Atlanta every year, and then the same in Durham and the same in Vermont. And where I started to get these transformational narratives about different religions actually engaging in interdependent, long-term, non-episodic relationships was from my students in those free classes all over the country. And so what stuck with me was the power of transformational narrative in people's lives. And the transformational narrative is the thing that keeps you running the marathon. You can have the sprint, and you can have a mantra to get you through the sprint, or a slogan of some kind, but the thing that's going to keep you doing the cross-country marathon race is that narrative that you keep coming back to over and over again. And so when I saw the power of that in people's lives, there's no greater privilege than to work on that and to listen to those throughout the country.
Thank you. Eboo.
So I'd say it's a combination of those concrete encounters that John is talking about and that Laurie are talking about. You know, my lunch table in high school were kids from all these different religious traditions, and actually one of the parents of my best friends in high school is here, and I want to thank you for not ratting me out to my own parents so many times in high school. See, I made something of myself after all. But you know, these kids from all different religious backgrounds: a South Indian Hindu, a Nigerian evangelical, a Cuban Jew, right? A Lutheran, a Catholic, and one of the things I realized was we had these wide conversations about all sorts of things, but we almost never double-clicked on people's faith identities, even though there was this plethora of faith identities literally around the table. Why not? Why didn't we kind of have the confidence or the language to inquire when somebody said, I can't play basketball on Sunday because of this prayer thing my parents are making me go to, right? It seems to me that locking ourselves out from that richness is a crime. What does it mean to be open-hearted and to enter that space in an appreciative way? So part of what keeps me going is the desire to do that. And the other thing I think that keeps me going is these abstractions that I feel like I am deeply a part of. There's a great line in Alistair McIntyre. He says, "I cannot tell you what I am going to do until I tell you the story or stories of which I am a part." And I'm a part of the story of Islam. I am part of the story of India. I am part of the story of America. And at the center of all of those stories is the question of diversity. How it is positively engaged, how the potluck of America or of India or of Islam has created a richer meal for that tradition and what that tradition can give to human civilization. So a big question for me is what role do I play in helping to write the next chapter of that? And incidentally, I just want to say that the person who I get my McIntyre from, a story that I am from, is Martin Marty, and he's in this room, and I'm so grateful to the role that he played in being supportive of IFYC in the early days, and you know, this whole book could be called Notes on Martin Marty. So thank you for your support and friendship of ours, and for really, in the last 50 years, being such a big part of writing the story of America's religious diversity.
Mr. Marty, would you recognize? Thank you. Okay, sort of a softball on the second question, but much harder. You spend so much of the words and your meaning and your discernment in the text that you've written in the book, imagining what it will be like to not just the process to get to a point where we are pragmatically pluralistic society, but what will it look like when we're succeeding? What can you truly imagine beyond all of your writing and scholarly work on the processes that we need to consider? What will the end product really look like? And what will be a couple of signs we've done this? I'm thinking of the concept of Judeo-Christian, the formation of that concept, which in the early years of this nation could never have been a unified concept per se, and yet it emerged through the middle of the 19th century. So what would a real success look like eventually?
You want me to start? I can start. You may not have read the book yet, and I'm so glad everyone's here. One of the things I argue for in the book is the idea that from the stories of interreligious interdependence that I've collected over the last couple of decades, the 4 areas where people actually create long-lasting relationships are buildings, the care of buildings, food, arts, production of the arts, and disaster and mourning, MOURNING. So what I think success would look like would be if every religious group in the United States, as they became more established as financially, in terms of social acceptance and so forth, asked as just a regular part of their living and being and thriving in America, are we sharing our building with a different religious group? Are we breaking bread with a different religious group? Are we creating arts with a different religious group? And when we have the opportunity to mourn or to acknowledge disaster, are we opening up rather than closing down? Those would be the 4 kinds of questions that I think every group should be asking no matter what, and thinking about ways in which they can create long-term, non-episodic relationships through those 4 things. So what success would look like is that you wouldn't see a synagogue without a room rented out in that synagogue to a Zen meditation group. You wouldn't see a Zendo without a regular Saturday conversation over food about prayer, etc. So that would be, I'm giving you a very specific answer, and then I want to let my other 2 folks. It's an everyday ethic.
I like the everyday ethic idea. I think part of it for me would be maybe to build on your vision a bit, but that each of those institutions would also know themselves really well and be able to name the differences that will inevitably remain. So one of the cautions, I know you haven't asked about cautions yet, but one of the cautions I have about some of this effort toward religious pluralism is a tendency to want to either water down or ignore the differences for the sake of unity. But I think the long-term vision only succeeds when we know what our differences are, we know what they are internally, and we know how to explain them externally, sometimes at the point of pain, and sometimes at the point of realizing that friendship, as much as we aspire for it, will have its limits precisely because of our differences.
So I'm a glass half full person just about all the way through, right? So in what is an incredibly painful moment in our history, I'm constantly wondering, number one, what are moments that have looked like this in previous eras in American history, and how did the forces of pluralism defeat the forces of prejudice then, and what are bright spots now? And so you alluded to one of those stories, which I actually want to double click on for a moment, the story of how America becomes a Judeo-Christian country. So I speak on a lot of college campuses, and one of the ways that I open my talks these days is a group of like wide-eyed 20-year-olds in the audience, all of whom did really well on standardized tests, and I'll say to them, you know, when the Pilgrims landed and they dusted off Plymouth Rock, they found the words Judeo-Christian nation etched on there. And people will like nod, like, yeah, I think I learned that. It was on the AP test, wasn't it? I'll be like, no, that's actually not what happened. So how did this come to be? How did America become a Judeo-Christian nation? So the answer actually comes out of an era that frankly feels a lot like ours right now. I'm talking about the 1920s, in which the United States at that point had experienced some decades of increased immigration from areas that the United States hadn't received immigration from, for, in this case, Southern and Eastern Europe. It was a time of economic polarization. It was a time of nativist movements. And in 1928, one of those nativist movements had a major victory. They basically set fire to the candidacy of a man named Al Smith, who was the first Catholic to be a presidential candidate on a major party ticket, the Democratic candidate for president. And the KKK at that time had something like 3 or 4 million members, and they said things like, if Al Smith wins the presidency, then the Pope will be arriving in Washington, D.C., and Al Smith will say one word to him, unpack, and we will live in a Catholic-dominated country, right? So these are the kinds of statements that tank the Al Smith candidacy. Well, a group of people after that happens decides, we can't be a nation that excludes the contributions of the increasing population of Jews and Catholics in the United States. So we have to not only do a whole bunch of civic projects of the sort that Laurie mentions to welcome their civic contributions, but we actually need to conceive of ourselves differently. And as you alluded to, Nancy, it's kind of a striking thing because Franklin Roosevelt at this time actually said, America is a Protestant nation, the Jews and Catholics are here under sufferance, right? So this kind of great liberal figure, says something that we consider very offensive. So what does this group do in response to that? This group calls themselves the NCCJ, the National Conference on Christians and Jews, one of the first interfaith organizations in America, renamed now the National Conference on Community and Justice, and they invent a term, Judeo-Christian. It's not a theologically accurate term. Jesus is at the center of the Christian tradition, Lord and Savior. My Jewish friends think he's a good rabbi. Maybe, let's discuss, right? It's not especially historically accurate. It's not like, frankly, Jews fared that well in Christian societies for millennia. What it is a genius civic invention. It is a genius new way of seeing the American story. One that says Jews and Catholics are here, a part of the American family like everybody else. So I think to myself, at a time when prejudice and polarization seem to be as strong as they were 70 or 80 years ago, at a time when there are now appreciable numbers of Muslims, Jains, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Sikhs, Baha'is, atheists, agnostics, what is the next chapter in that American narrative? And because it's delicious, I propose that we think of ourselves as a potluck nation. But Judeo-Christian did good work for 70 years. What's next, right? It reminds me of the great insight by Roland Barthes, who said, a myth is a story that has gotten so deeply woven into a culture that that culture forgets that at one point somebody wrote that story. So a group of people, not unlike us, writes the story Judeo-Christian in the 1930s as a response to anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. What's the story that we are writing in response to Islamophobia and anti-immigrant prejudice and anti-Black prejudice?
It's the moment to do that, isn't it? Okay, when Dr. Robbie Jones showed the picture of what seemed to me to be a Midwestern, probably Protestant family having dinner together, I was reminded how private some individuals of all faith traditions consider their religious life to be. For some, it's never spoken of outside of themselves or their small family groups. So I want to raise the notion of reaching this pluralistic and pragmatically pluralistic religious diversity, where religious literacy becomes a standard in our work lives, in our educational lives, in our family lives. How do we seek the wider we, and I'm borrowing from Dr. Laurie Patton on this phrase, how do we attain the wider, more inclusive we when we know that religion for many who may have open hearts but are not interested in sharing their religious views is a reality and a conundrum that we face? So given the aspirations that are outlined in the text, how do you address the notion that religion, and perhaps now more than ever, in at least some quarters, there is a pulling in, an insularity? Comments on that? John?
Well, maybe to start with the idea that I don't think the insularity is all bad. And so, in other words, protecting insularity, protecting difference, giving people the opportunity to develop, whether you call them safe spaces or associations or in-groups, that's an important part of who we are existing together. And that comes with a risk, and we should acknowledge the risk, and it comes with costs of exclusion, costs of internal norms that will be in tension with external norms, but that's part of the game, I think. Part of the game that we're all playing, not in a pejorative sense, but living together means allowing for those differences to flourish. And so I think that's step one of the challenge that we face. And then encouraging each other out of those differences to dialogue across them, which is going to require maybe more efforts than we have on the table right now.
I'd say something interesting has happened, which is, first of all, I think the wider we, when it comes to religious identity in the public sphere, has been invoked, particularly, I would say, most dramatically in the 90s when identity politics became such the combination of the rise of the internet and identity politics coming together was kind of an explosion of religion actually being very much part of a world where if you needed to be an activist in the public sphere and agitate on behalf of your religious group's interests, you could do that. It was indexed, however, to a cultural identity as much as it was to a particular religious identity. And so I think that has always been, at least for the last 20 years or so, part and parcel of a more public we that's gone alongside of the more private we that you're talking about. So I would say there's a sub-theme to what you're saying where the public we and religious identity as a form of cultural identity has always been there. Mm-hmm. But I think the broader thing, and it's kind of related to that question, is this is going to sound like a very odd thing to say, but Eboo and I teach about this, and I think both Robbie and John really pushed Eboo in this book on this question, which is, what kind of secular civic sphere are you talking about? What is the grounding of this possibility of interdependence between religions that is non-episodic, that could create that dialogue? And I didn't take you to task on this, but the other two did say you're a little too optimistic here, pal. But I would say for me, the most important thing is to create in our certainly educational environments, beginning with K all the way up through 16 and beyond, a different understanding and possibility of reflection of what that civic space is that allows religion to both exist and to be intelligible. One of the biggest philosophical debates right now, still going on, with the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, is all about whether when religious groups enter the public sphere, they actually can be intelligible to people who are motivated by secular reason. So when you say, I fast on Ramadan, is that intelligible to a lawmaker in some fundamental sense? And so I think asking folks to rethink the very conditions in the civic space where religious freedom and religious conversation, religious language is even possible is, I think, the fundamental thing that we need to do in order to create that better sense of we. I'm interestingly, as a scholar of religion, wanting to turn to the profound dimensions of our secularity to revitalize our conversation around religion.
So there's a great insight by Peter Berger who says one of the reasons that elite academics don't study religion, many of them, is because they're not religious themselves. And then he says, but the truth of the matter is the faculty club at the University of Chicago is the exception in the world, right? The rest of the world is religious. And I think similarly, I wonder if the notion that religion is a private thing is a quirk of white mainline Protestants. And lots of other people are actually quite public about their religions, frankly, including white mainline Protestants. Just for most of the nation's history, they just call that America, right? And I'm just being descriptive about that, nothing but descriptive, right? So I lived in England for 3.5 years, and if you want to talk about a place who will look at you cross-eyed if you have a public expression of faith, it's that society. I mean, Tony Blair's press secretary famously says, "We don't do God," right? Every American president has taken an oath of office on the Bible, and as says kind of de rigueur, God bless America. So I think that we're actually a very expressively religious nation, and I think that in large part that has been positive. It's impossible to imagine the kind of American literary, the American tradition of how we imagine the nation without religious language, right? So you think of Lincoln's Better Angels of Our Nature, you think of King's Beloved Community, you think of Jane Addams' Cathedral of Humanity. These are all kind of religious contributions to how America understands itself. If you think about American civil society, it is at least 50%, I'm using Robert Putnam's statistics here, inspired, driven by religious communities. You can see that in American higher education where, of the nation's 1,300 private colleges, at least half were founded by religious communities, right? Or religious inspiration. Northwestern, Methodist. University of Chicago, Baptist. Loyola, DePaul, Dominican, Catholic. So our civil religion, our national narrative, our civil society, huge religious components. I think what is a really important opportunity right now is how are the newer religious communities with appreciable numbers. Again, Muslims have been in this country for 400 years, but it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that we've reached appreciable numbers and kind of the public glare. What contributions will we be making? And this is one of the arguments that or conversations that Robbie and I have, which is, I don't want to end the American civil religion tradition before we Muslims get to make our contribution, right? I mean, I want the nation to know about the Inner City Muslim Action Network, which is the chapter that I end the book with, right? And I mean, if you read that chapter on this unbelievable collective of people who are African American Muslim and Palestinian Muslim and really observant and not so observant, and city and suburbs, and working with Pentecostal churches and doing iftar at the local synagogue and putting up the first permanent memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. in the city of Chicago, you'd be like, man, Eboo, you are a really great fiction writer. Right? This can't exist, but actually it does. And Rami and Ali are here, right? Two of the founders of that collective. I want that to kind of take its place in the American pantheon of this. This is what it means for a community to contribute to American civilization. That notion of Muslims contributing to America as Medina, a place where immigrants are holy and welcomers are holy. Right? Like so many other religious communities had an opportunity to kind of contribute to America's ideascape. I don't want that ideascape to stop welcoming religious contributions until my Jain friends, my Buddhist friends, my Baha'i friends, and my brothers and sisters who are Muslim get to make that contribution.
More at the potluck.
Yeah.
Would Nancy, the two of you who've been responsible for the Islamic Center stand up so that we may recognize you? Are you right there? Thank you.
I think both of us are going to want to follow up on this.
Okay.
Are you good with us going with this?
Yeah,
okay.
Laurie, why don't you, and then John.
I want to cross-examine the witness here. And so, Eboo, I love the vision, as you know, but what you just described, going to Robbie's numbers, is 2 to 6% of the American population, incorporating them in. So I would love to hear you talk more about the 24% of the religiously unaffiliated and how the we narrative factors them in. But just as a matter of numbers, that's a pretty large segment of the country to be thinking about.
Right. So I think it's interesting to note that Jews also make up about 2%. Right. So what I mean to say is I don't know if it's just numbers that matter here. I think it's also contributions. Clearly, the Jewish contribution to American civil religion and civil society has been extremely important. Having said that, I think that it's a really important question, right? Which is, how does an interfaith America how does it understand people who are atheists, agnostics, or seekers? I think there's a couple of answers to this. Number one, at IFYC, because we carry the baggage of graduate school and like to define our terms as well as possible. We often talk about religious diversity as diverse orientations around religion, which could mean Sufi or Salafi in Islam. It could mean atheist or agnostic, right? Which is to say, being an atheist or agnostic is a totally legitimate orientation around religion, which is to say, I either don't have one or I come at it at an angle that is different from how we would understand a typical world religion. One of the things we do is we highlight heroes who are not specifically religious as part of building interfaith America. You know, King's, one of his, perhaps his closest white friend in the civil rights movement is a guy named Stanley Levinson, who's an atheist, right? And kind of an avowed atheist. King said he didn't believe that. Stan was too spiritual to be an atheist, but it is very interesting to consider the numbers of people who claim to not be religious who are part of movements of interfaith cooperation. And one of the interesting things about America's non-religious is the numbers who say they believe in God. So if you disaggregate, or the numbers who say they pray, right? So if you disaggregate the nuns, it's not all atheists, and certainly even within that number, it's not atheists who are necessarily hostile to religion. It's people who don't fit into the easy boxes on, who are the other people who do surveys? Robbie, do you remember? The Pew, right? No, we don't remember them. But I think part of this is to make the problem isn't the people checking the boxes on surveys. The problem is, are the boxes complicated enough to recognize the different ways that people understand their identities in relationship to the cosmic?
John, your major challenge to Eboo in the book is to respect the differences and also to be a little bit more realistic going forward. Does this answer help to answer your inquiry?
Well, it helps. I worry though that the we can start to look pretty thin. So the we that motivates interfaith cooperation is often a deeply understood tradition that says this is why, as Christians or Jews or Muslims, or out of service to God, we move forward across difference. If it's a vaguer sense of spirituality or the sacred or maybe an openness to God, that I'm less sure about the content that motivates people to move toward one another.
So I would say, do you want to
go? The one thing I want to say is for our work at IFYC, and I think for the way that I'm the writing in this book, it's not a theological construction. It's not an I as a believer recognize you as a believer, and now we can do things together. And we can have interesting discussions about our different beliefs. It is a civic construction, which is to say that I am a part of American society, and I seek to learn and contribute. You aren't a part of American society, and you seek to learn and contribute. A significant part of that society is made up of the social capital and narratives that involve religious ideas, understandings, and communities, including people who come at what we might call a non-traditional angle to those. So I think that understanding it as a civic base instead of a theological base answers some of the question. Having said that, I still think the term interfaith clearly suggests some kind of a relationship with what we typically think of as a religious tradition. A significant part of our country does not at least immediately resonate with that.
Laura, we need a somewhat brief response so we can gather some of our questions. Excellent. And then we can go back to myth.
Yeah, so I think, I hope we can come back to the question of the we and the nuns, because I think there's some interesting commonalities that Robbie hasn't studied yet, but that we could draw out, and I want to come back to that. But I think more importantly here, I want to just raise the role of history and the role of finding moments in our history that actually show the kind of interdependence that we didn't even know we had. And that's, I think, important to look at, for instance, in thinking about the we. I think there are we's in history that we don't even know existed yet. I'll give one brief example, and that is Greenville-Spartanburg, and the lecture I gave on interfaith work in Greenville-Spartanburg was the most amazing example. Why? Because unbeknownst to most people who would think stereotypically about the South, there were Muslims there for 30, 40 years, and Jews there for 30, 40 years, and neither population was big enough to have a full halal or a full kosher service. So they started to talk to each other literally 30 or 40 years ago and say, we need to actually do a cooperative halal kosher thing. And so that's what they've been doing for 40 years. Now, if you said, where is the place where there is a cooperative kosher halal food service going on? You would say Chicago or New York or LA. You wouldn't say Greenville-Spartanburg, and there it was. And the thing that was the most exciting, this is what I mean by writing histories, the most exciting about that collaboration was the anxiety and joint connection that they felt when the Department of Health and Human Services came along to inspect them, right? Because they are suddenly in the civic space, and they know they're in that civic space. So that's an example of recent history where there's a we that we have to uncover, and that we tells a very, very different story about America. It's not utopian necessarily, but it's highly pragmatic and it's interdependent, again, with the secular sphere. And I think those are the kinds of histories that we need to uncover.
Do we have some questions now that we might be able to take from our audience? We'll come back.
My main approach to this book was getting my friends to argue with me in print. So,
you succeeded.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Absolutely.
You know, one thought, as we're getting the questions, one thought on what fills the content of the we, and with your story about the necessity of getting the food, right, and the collective action need. It reminded me, I was just teaching this morning a law and religion class, and what came to mind was my experience in basic training with the Air Force, where at the time we had to get over the wall or do push-ups. We didn't actually know each other's religious or political backgrounds. We just had a kind of a do or die situation. Not literally die, but it felt like it, right? And so when we have these practical problems that we have to solve and we need each other to solve, then we can start to fill the content of the we. But I think my sense is that you, and certainly Eboo, see that as a pragmatic, ground-up sort of effort that can, and one of my questions to Eboo in the book is, do we need a kind of top-down narrative to support that, or can it just be instances that happen?
Well, while we're waiting for these cards, my personal experience with Interfaith Youth Corps has convinced me that a part of this is that kind of necessity of coming together. Most of it is around very energetic young people who are learning to live these values and are sharing and moving forward together. Okay, ready for some other questions? Here we go. Please reflect on the importance of racial and ethnic diversity as it intersects with religious diversity. Eboo, why don't you start with that one, and then others can take it.
So I think it's, for me, what was very formative was the study of the civil rights movement and how it intertwined racial and religious issues, and also the struggle in South Africa. You know, one of the kind of kairos moments of my life is being in Cape Town in 1999 at the Parliament of the World's Religions when Mandela is speaking, and the first thing he says is, I would not be free if it wasn't for the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians and the Hindus and the African indigenous traditions of South Africa coming together in the struggle against apartheid. And the civil rights movement is similar to that, how King relies so deeply on his own Christian tradition. You know, I love the film Selma by Ava DuVernay, and you know, what does King do when he's feeling despondent at midnight? He calls Mahalia Jackson and he says, sing me a gospel song, right? What does he do on the Edmund Pettus Bridge when you know, there's a row of police with truncheons that have his head written on those truncheons. He kneels and he prays, right? Who are some of the people that he learns from and works with most deeply? Thich Nhat Hanh, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Mahatma Gandhi. These people's writings, reflections, partnerships are about this kind of liberation across the range. Heschel and King meet here at the Chicago Conference on Religion and Race in 1963, and the sermon that Heschel gives at this conference is how are religion and race even mentioned in the same breath in terms of religion being a support for a kind of racism. Religion is necessarily an overcoming of racism and a kind of unifying of that divide. So I don't think about them separately in the civic sense. I do think that that the nature of religious identity is different than the nature of racial identity, and I think that their histories in the United States are different, and that makes for some kind of interesting back and forth conversation.
As a funder from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, we've given a great deal of money to this project nationwide, including IFYC. We've also been funding some interfaith literacy in the professions, so for journalists, for doctors, for hospital CEOs, for city council members in different pockets around the nation. And what we've learned about this is that folks might be more willing to talk about interfaith literacy as both an intellectual and personal exploration, and following that, they become much more open on issues of racial inequality, racial diversity, and economic inequality.
And Nancy, I would say all the more reason, therefore, if you're going to get normative, and I love your exhortation to us to do so, I think that it is incumbent upon religious communities in the United States to reflect about race. So yes, we can acknowledge intersectionality. What's the moral component of acknowledging intersectionality? Therefore, we need to reflect on race for that very reason. I would also say, Eboo, I disagree with you a little bit. I think race has a deeply religious component in the United States especially. If you take your definition of religion as orienting, or faith tradition as orienting around the sacred, one way to think about the sacred is that experience of a community in which they were almost annihilated but weren't. Jewish, Holocaust, slavery, chattel slavery for African Americans in the United States. There's a profoundly religious and spiritual element to that I think can and should be reflected on and treated in the same way as one would a faith tradition.
I'll just add on that. I loved Robbie's presentation that focuses us on the question of white Christianity and the work that's still needed to continue to disentangle that category. And your question on the 1950s is brilliant because that sets up the stark divide. I am in some, I hate the label and I hesitate to say it here, but I am in some ways an evangelical Christian, although the adjective is complicated these days. We would have many disagreements, but when you ask me the 1950s question, it's an easy answer for me. No, I do not want to go back to the 1950s. That was 7 years after my grandparents were incarcerated as Japanese Americans, and my dad was born at Manzanar. And so there's no sense in which I look back at the 1950s and think those were the glory days. But when you look at the polling numbers, right, and the tremendous and stark differences for white Christians that support not only a view but a culture, and this is a funding question, so where the money sources are in that pocket of white Christianity, the value set that comes from that, and so I think especially within Protestant Christianity, the complicated history is deeply embedded in race, and the extent to which I think a lot of white Christians have not yet reconciled that any move forward in this country has to reconcile with the ongoing past and the sins of the past when it comes to race.
Ready for another question? How is the matter of religious diversity essentially a moral imperative? Would we and should we use that as the invitation?
You and I are looking at each other.
I'm looking at both of you.
I mean, I guess that the straightforward answer, I love that question, is that I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it wasn't, at a certain level. But I like the second part of the question a lot, which is, how do we then begin with that? I would say, that's why we love what Robbie does and that other foundation beginning with P, right? Which is that there are realities facing us to which we need to respond ethically. And if religious diversity is one of those realities, then it is absolutely incumbent upon us to find, and that I always add everyday ethic, because I think that pragmatic pluralism as an everyday ethic is really unromantic. It's totally unsexy. It involves, again, buildings and cooking together and all these kinds of things. And it's profoundly local. And so for all those reasons, I would say it's a moral imperative, but not in the sense of a Kantian, big philosophical moral imperative. Of course, it's also that. But the reason why Rami's work is so successful is because it's unrelentingly local. And I think that's the way I would put it. I would say absolutely yes, a moral imperative, but with the 3 or 4 descriptors that make it not from on high, but absolutely from the ground.
I mean, it's a complicated question because moral is sort of a too top level of a term. You mentioned McIntyre a while ago, Eboo, and one of McIntyre's key insights is there's not just a category of moral or ethical, but we have tradition-based understandings. And within each of these traditions, there are ongoing contested arguments. So there are Muslims who would say, yes, it is a moral imperative to work across faith divides. And there are Muslims who would say no. And there are Christians who would say no. And there are Jews who would say no. And so all of us up here, I think, might say, yes, there's a moral imperative. We would all want you to share that. But how that plays out within each faith community is, I think, an unanswered question, and that deserves our continued attention.
Just to build on that, and this is something that's so important if we're going to talk about moral imperatives, and I worry that it's very easy for the synagogue to invite the Zendo. But if we were really deeply pragmatically pluralist, would a liberal church make sure that it rented out a room to the Pentecostal conservative evangelical? That pragmatic pluralism is the much, much harder thing for us right now.
And that's where you move from unsexy pragmatic pluralism to sexy confident pluralism.
You just gave me the title of my next book. Right. Thank you, John. Working it.
So I actually think, so I'm going to come out again as an American optimist on this, right? So I think the United States is an opportunity to do all 3 of these things, which is a pragmatic pluralism, a national narrative around pluralism, and theological pluralism, right? So because the United States is a relatively open civic culture in which you can't build the Inner City Muslim Action Network in Market Park and expect to do good work without partnering with the local Pentecostal church and the synagogue, right? So that pragmatically happens. You might as well figure out how to tell a greater story about that, which is precisely where you get the national narratives of Cathedral of Humanity, Beloved Community, et cetera, right? So Rami is exceptional at this. So let's tell a story of Marquette Park where all of these different communities are working together. And by the way, when we are invited by Rabbi Fanier to do iftar in the synagogue, we Muslims have to think about our theological tradition and what from our own tradition would inspire us in this partnership, right? So I actually think also it begins with the pragmatics, not kind of it's not a theological Platonic ideal, like there's the ideal first, let's enact it in America. It's more like, hey, the Pentecostals are here and they're the best community organizing trainers in the neighborhood. We got to work with them. Well, we might as well tell a really beautiful story about this because it turns out to be inspiring to work with them. And lo and behold, there's actually these great stories within the Muslim tradition of how Christians, the monk Bahira, the monk Waraka were the first people to recognize the prophethood of Islam. I actually think that those stories get recovered right? More Muslims know the Bahira and the Waraka story now, and the story of Abyssinia and the Negus, which is to say the stories of positive Christian-Muslim interaction. More Muslims know those stories now because they have had positive cooperation with Christians, particularly in the crucible of post 9/11 America.
I'll read one more from our audience. How is the United States a safe haven for religious diversity when throughout its national history, religious minorities have been persecuted by the full society? How is the United States a safe haven for what we're talking about when throughout its history, religious minorities have been persecuted?
So I'll begin quickly on this. So I think that if you took, Josh is waving that 1 minute sign.
I know.
Proactively, we will be quick. So maybe amongst the most famous sermons in American history is John Winthrop, 1630, coming across the Atlantic on the Arabella, the city on a hill, right? Like we will rejoice in each other, we will labor together, we'll welcome each other. It's this kind of beautiful notion of American community. Well, John Winthrop comes across the Atlantic to build what he calls a bulwark against the Antichrist, which he says is the Pope. America begins as an anti-Catholic project. So a really interesting question is, when we tell the story of America, do we tell the story of American anti-Catholicism, which, by the way, Arthur Schlesinger Sr. once said, the deepest bias in the American people is anti-Catholic prejudice. There's a lot of communities that have claim to that crown. Schlesinger gives it to Catholics. Do we tell that story? Or do we tell the story that in the Obama administration, the entire presidential line of succession, the vice president, the Secretary of State, and the Speaker of the House are all Catholic? And by the way, it's at a time when the Supreme Court, 6 out of 9 Catholics, and Pope Francis, my wife and I are in the South Lawn of the White House when this happens, in October 2015, comes to the White House, and I look around for signs of a papal takeover. None. Right? So which story do we tell? Do we tell the story of America's deeply anti-Catholic history, or do we tell the story of the significant contribution that Catholics have made to American society and the welcome that most of them feel now? Which story do we tell?
Comments or additions to the question?
I love the question, and I think the answer is that one response could be, it's never been a fully safe haven, but we've always been open to the idea of a safer haven. In other words, making it safer and safer and safer. If we're going to do Puritan examples, I grew up in Salem Village. It is absolutely in my core to think about what happens when a group of people get together and tell a story that they may or may not believe and accuse other people, and all hell breaks loose. And that's exactly what happened in my hometown. What we don't know, we know about the evil Reverend Parris, who created so much of this discord amongst people that caused accusations of witchcraft. What we don't know, does anyone know in here what happened after everybody was hung and finally people realized that there was too much damage for this small community and small city to bear in 1692? Nobody knows. How did that community heal? There's a guy, has anyone heard of Joseph Green? Joseph Green is the guy that followed Reverend Parris in that parish. And it was his sermons underneath the bed of our local archivist. They're still there. They haven't been cataloged yet. In the late 1600s, early 1700s, that talked about what we needed to do to create a new space in order to rebuild Salem Village and what was one of the most disastrous and in some ways paradigmatic examples of religious persecution in our country. So I would say that what Joseph Green did, he also rearranged the seating. He made Abigail Putnam, one of the great accusers, sit next to the family of the accused who had been hung. over and over again, he rearranges seating. Every Sunday, you had no idea who you were going to sit next to, and you had to listen to Joseph Green talk about reconciliation. Nobody knows about Joseph Green. Now all of you do, so I'm really excited about that. And the reason why I tell that story is because that, to me, is what we need to do every time, is safer haven, safer haven, safer haven.
To Eboo's question of which story do you tell, I think the answer is you tell both stories. And so to give my 5 cents on the Puritan theme, you tell the story of not just the Puritan control, but the story of Roger Williams and William Penn and the experiments in religious liberty that have led from their work. And you tell the story of the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses that led to a 1942 Supreme Court opinion that led to even more persecution and killing that because their rights weren't protected. And then you tell the story of the 1943 opinion in Barnett that overrules that opinion and says, no, we do protect the religious liberty of Jehovah's Witnesses. So it's a mixed story. It's not a pretty story, and I think we do ourselves a disservice if we paint too kind of a narrative for ourselves. But we also need to talk about the successes and that they're real, they're hard fought, and they matter.
We're at the end here.
Close. Go ahead.
These are
One
closing
last
lines?
question. Go ahead.
Okay. The NCCJ tells the story of Judeo-Christian America before it exists. And they will it into existence. So part of, I think, the power of story is, and I get this straight out of Marty's One in the Many, right, is the ability of that story, if it is accompanied by a set of civic action, which frequently the story inspires, is you have a chance to will that story into existence, right? Marty in the One of the Many tells this beautiful story of one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov, the great rabbi. He was paralyzed. He would get so excited when he told stories of his teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, that he felt like he had to act them out. And he actually stood up and started dancing out these stories, right? So I think that that's part of what we do with stories. I don't think that story is just, is enough. But if we only tell the story of John Winthrop as an anti-Catholic bigot, which he was, are we creating a sense of inevitability in a story that we don't actually want into existence, right? I think about the first sermon that King gives. He has 20 minutes to write this sermon when the first night of the Montgomery bus boycott. And he gets up there and he says, if we are wrong, those people who would march for our dignity and freedom, then the Constitution of the United States is wrong. Well, you know what? The Constitution says king is 3/5 of a person. But he is telling a story about a reimagining of that Constitution. It does not yet exist. He is telling a story and he is willing it into existence.
You all are thought leaders, scholars, practitioners of this higher value, and some would say a moral imperative for all of us. What's the one kernel from the book that you'd like to share with everyone that you think is the most important point you were making? John, would you go first, please?
I'm going to say the most important point is not my point, but it's Eboo's point, and it's what he just said, but it's worth underscoring, that it actually does matter that we tell stories, that we tell good stories, that we tell honest stories, that we tell encouraging stories, and in some ways we're going against the grain to do that, particularly when we start, as we've been talking here, about the local and the unsexy, that those are harder stories to tell, but they're imaginative stories that can capture other people's imagination, and we have to work really hard to be good storytellers, and it's not necessarily going to come easy, but that is, I think, part of the moral imperative.
Thank you. Laurie?
I love the fact that my piece was the one about myth, but you guys have been saying the most about story, so my job is done. I love it. I would say that what I learned from all of the essays, Eboo's anchoring one and the 3 responses, was I want everyone to close the book and walk away and ask themselves and their communities, what is the most compelling and unexpected way that I can create a we in America?
Eboo, the last words are yours.
I think that South Africa is not defined by apartheid, it's defined by the response to apartheid. That America is not defined by slavery, it's in segregation, it's defined principally by the response to it. And I think we're living in an ugly moment, and we have a chance to respond to it in a way that defines the next era. The 20th century didn't belong to the KKK, it belonged to the NCCJ because of how they responded to the KKK. That's the opportunity we have.
And with that as closing thought, let me make a few announcements for us together as a group. The first is to mention that the Our Compelling Interest book series has a few more publications in the queue. The next one will center around higher education merit and opportunity. You could stay connected to Our Compelling Interests group and the thought leadership there for the nation at a very easy email, socialsolutions@michigan.edu. socialsolutions@umichigan.edu. As far as the book, we have some for you tonight, of course, but for other friends and neighbors and colleagues, they can purchase the book at press.princeton.edu and also, of course, at amazon.com. I want to note that tonight we're having a cocktail reception here at the Chicago Stock Exchange Room here in the Art Institute, and we also have the opportunity to see James Webb's prayer exhibit while we're here in the building. So I want to thank again, Earl, thank you so much for hosting this, Nancy, for Rob, for your terrific work. Thank you, Dr. Al Young, for all that you've done, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you.